Good morning and welcome to session 2 of this year's King Hall Conference. This session deals with partnerships and national interest, World War II amphibious operations in the Southwest Pacific. And of course this is remarkably timely, being the 75th anniversary of the Leyte Gulf operations, which were the largest maritime sea battle in naval history. And I'd like to acknowledge the presence of Admiral Guy Griffiths, who's with us today, who served in HMAS Shropshire during that campaign. And later this month, Guy and a number of veterans will be at the Battle of Surigao Strait, 75th anniversary in the Philippines. So if there's one operation that brings all the elements of naval power together, it is amphibious operations. And this morning I'm joined by 3 distinguished historians who have all studied Australia's involvement in amphibious operations in World War II. First there's Professor Peter Dean, who's Pro-Vice Chancellor of the University of Western Australia. And then there's Dr. Karl James, who's the Senior Historian at the Australian War Memorial, and Dr. Rhys Crawley, who's a visiting fellow at the ANU's Strategic Defence Studies Centre. And the final speaker will be myself. So first off, I'd just like to ask Peter Dean if he could present his paper. We'll be speaking for about 10 minutes each, and then there'll be a question and answer period.
Thanks, Peter. Thank you all, and thank you to the Sea Power Centre for the invitation. I'm a Sydney boy and Perth's a long way from home now, so any opportunity to get back here is great. So I just want to talk about capability development particularly today. So I'm going to really focus on the training elements, capability developments, and how these operations, how the training component was put together. Despite the strong focus of Australian military history on the landing at Gallipoli, the amphibious component of this operation is merely an adjunct to the Anzac legend. Thereafter, a perceived lack of strategic need for an amphibious capability after this operation led to an almost total absence of training and doctrine development in Australia in the period up until 1942. The only interwar engagement with amphibious operations occurred in 1935 when Tasmanian militia forces from the 40th Battalion landed at Blackman's Bay south of Hobart from the cruisers HMAS Canberra and HMS Sussex. An exercise that was only remarkable due to its oddity at the time, but also for its total air of unreality as an exercise. However, by 1942, the strategic need for an amphibious capability was staring the Australian military leaders in the face. Despite the focus early in the year on stemming the Japanese advance and then on the land campaign in Papua, if the Allies were ever going to get off the island of New Guinea, then an amphibious capability was going to be critical. While the strategic rationale was obvious in 1942, the key question was how were they going to build such a capability from scratch with no culture, no doctrine, and no equipment. The first step was to acknowledge the need, and despite being on the strategic defensive, with the prospect of a potential Japanese operations against Australia still being debated, in mid-March of 1942, the Deputy Chief of the General Staff in Australia, Major General Sidney Rowell, recommended the acquisition of specialist equipment and the establishment of a school of what was called Combined Operations for Amphibious Warfare. While Australia was neither well organised nor experienced in amphibious warfare, nor was the new Theatre Commander-in-Chief, General Douglas MacArthur, in early 1942, or his staff, or the US Army units that were in the theatre, the RAN and the USN forces allocated to the theatre also lacked experience. Furthermore, the priorities set by the Allied leaders and the combined chiefs of staff meant that MacArthur had little hope of large-scale reinforcements from the United States Navy or Marine Corps, or large-scale drafts of amphibious ships, craft and equipment. This meant that the Southwest Pacific Theatre was largely on its own in establishing this capability and would only benefit from large drafts of amphibious equipment after 1943. And this was mainly due to the delay in operations in other theatres such as the Central Pacific, Europe and the Mediterranean. The key RAN pioneer in amphibious warfare was Commander, later Captain, Frederick Norton Cook. Now Cook had a colourful career, being sunk twice, once in 1939 and once in 1940, and after that he basically was given a shore command of HMS Tormentor, a Royal Navy landing craft training school in the UK. He also commanded the landing craft for the raid on Brunaville in German-occupied France on the night of the 27th to 28th of February 1942, for which he received the Distinguished Service Cross. Soon afterwards, he was recalled to Australia to lead the RAN's efforts to establish an amphibious capability. In Cook, the RAN was exceptionally lucky. Not only did his Royal Naval Service see him gain enormous experience in amphibious operations, he was also an officer of great skill and ability, regularly praised in his annual efficiency reports for being exceptionally capable. Cook would team up with two senior Army officers, Lieutenant Colonel N.W. Hope of the Royal Artillery, previously the senior instructor of the British Amphibious Warfare School in Egypt, and Major Alfred Rose, AIF, from the 1st Australian Army Headquarters. These three officers undertook an aerial reconnaissance down the length of the eastern seaboard in June of 1942 to search for appropriate sites for training facilities. The subsequent Hope-Cook report recommended a centre for amphibious training of staff at Port Stephens on the New South Wales mid-north coast and a training school for units at Torbal Point in Queensland. In the following month, General MacArthur issued an instruction for the establishment of what he called a Joint Overseas Operational Training School at Port Stephens at the site recommended in the Hope-Cook report. This school was designed as a US and Australian facility and an Army and Navy and Air Force training centre. MacArthur described its mission as the training of land forces in overseas operations in conjunction and cooperation with naval and air forces on all aspects of amphibious warfare. The plan called for a force of 1 corps to be trained in amphibious operations made up of 2 US and 1 Australian divisions. Thus, a 2/3, 1/3 split was carried through in the provision of staff, equipment, logistics and the costs of setting up these schools. Jutes opened on the 15th of August 1942 and its staff included Lieutenant Colonel Hope and another UK officer highly experienced in amphibious warfare, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas K. Walker, previously the Deputy Assistant Adjutant General for the Royal Marines. To meet the rapidly increasing demands for unit level training, in addition to Jutes, the Allied Land Forces under General Blamey set up the 1st Australian Army Combined Training School at Torbal Point in Queensland under the command of the newly promoted now Lieutenant Colonel Rose, which opened on the 11th of August 1942. To supplement these 2 Army-run training schools, the RAN established HMAS Assault alongside Jutes at Port Stephens on the 1st of September 1942 under command of Commander Cook. Its main role was the training of the crews of the RAN's new landing craft for the 3 armed merchant cruisers, HMAS Westralia, Canberra and Manura, that were being converted to landing ships infantry, and to support the training being conducted at Jutes. At Torbal Point, the RAN established a small boat training facility under the command of Lieutenant John Morrell Band, RAN, in October of 1942. Lieutenant Band was later killed at Finschhafen as a beachmaster. All of the junior and mid-ranking officers involved in these facilities were incredibly important, and from the very start, the Hope-Cook report cooperation between the Army and the Navy was paramount. I cannot overstate the importance of these officers, their innovation, their engagement, their leadership and their effectiveness in making this capability a reality. Now, despite this promising start, there were 4 early difficulties that plagued the development of an amphibious capability. First was inter-allied rivalry, and this was absolutely bitter in 1942 between MacArthur's headquarters and the Australians, and particularly at the senior levels of command, and it played out spectacularly in the amphibious realm, when the first commander of Jutes, a US Army colonel by the name of Byron Q. Jones, was summarily sacked 3 months into the job after he clashed bitterly and repeatedly with Walker and Hope, the UK officers, as well as all of the Australian officers at the training school. Second was equipment. This was sorely lacking, especially landing craft and ships. Thus, improvisation played a major role, with the RAN and the Royal Australian Engineers developing their own prototype landing craft based on British models because there was simply none that we could bring into the country, and also making extensive use of dry shod training on dummy equipment that was set up to replicate them. The third was doctrine and command. Doctrine, like command, was split, with the Australian using UK amphibious doctrine and US forces at the training school using United States Marine Corps and Naval doctrine, an unsustainable basis for future coalition operations. The fourth one was the tyranny of distance. Port Stephens is on the central coast of New South Wales, where almost all of the troops to be trained in amphibious operations by this time were based in Queensland. And as the front line moved further north, so did the bulk of those troops. These problems were solved with the arrival of Rear Admiral Daniel Barbie and his 7th Amphibious Force, along with some innovative localised solutions driven by the experience on the ground and the initiative of officers like Cook, Ban, Rose, Hope and Walker. Inter-allied and inter-service rivalry never riddled the middle ranks of the officers as it did the High Command. Rose and Ban, for instance, formed an exceptionally close bond and team at Toorbul Point, while Cook developed an excellent relationship with the new commander of Jutes, US Brigadier General Volkenberger. Now, Admiral Barbie was an outstanding choice for this command. He had considerable experience in amphibious warfare, having worked on the development of the doctrine with the US Marine Corps in the interwar period, and most recently he had been on Admiral King's staff as the amphibious warfare testing section and developing new landing ships and landing craft. The US naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison described his appointment as, quote, a Christmas gift for MacArthur. On arrival, Barbie was given command of all amphibious forces and all training in the theatre. As a concession, Barbie realised that it would be absolutely critical to include the Australians on his staff and for a close bond to develop with the Australians at both the training and operational levels. As such, a number of Australian Navy and Army officers were attached to Barbie's headquarters, the most important being Brigadier Ronald Hopkins. Hopkins would play a central part in Barbie's headquarters, commanding one of his 2 planning cells in 1943 and 44, earning himself the Legion of Merit for exceptional meritorious conduct. In the end, Barbie's insistence with both MacArthur's headquarters and the Australians for a centralised command structure was absolutely essential in professionalising the training and the conduct of amphibious operations. The first thing Barbie did when he arrived was to take over the amphibious warfare training system. Jutes and Toorbul Point were brought together under a single amphibious training group that was placed under United States Navy officer Captain J.W. Jameson, who had considerable experience in amphibious operations in the Atlantic and had served as a beach master during the North African landings. This ATG was to establish amphibious training centres at both Port Stephens and Toorbul Point, taking over from the existing schools. One of the hallmarks of the 7 Amphibious Forces operations was the exceptionally close and mutually supportive working relationships between the USN, the RAN and the Australian Army. So much so, in fact, that these relationships were much closer than what the US Navy enjoyed with the US Army. Jameson, Cook and the Allied staff at the now renamed Amphibious Training Centre then worked collaboratively to develop a hybrid form of amphibious doctrine for the Southwest Pacific area based on the geography of the theatre and the collections of vessels that became available in January of 1943, namely landing ship tanks, landing ship infantry and landing craft mechanised, that formed the backbone of the 7th Amphibious Force. These were supported by the 3 RAN's landing ship infantry and only 1 USN equivalent amphibious ship that the US Navy gave to this theatre. Distance was solved by the advent of 3 mobile training teams, 1 Australian and 2 US based, with each nationality supplying the personnel, equipment and landing craft for their mobile training teams, who would then train units based on the availability of those units, not the nationality. And as you can see here, the Australian unit pretty much only trained US forces during 43 and 44, and one of the US units trained the Australian forces during this period. In addition, the ATC at Port Stephens was moved to Toorbul Point on the 1st of October 1942, and a new amphibious training centre was established in Cairns of June of 1943, and HMAS Assault, which by the beginning of October 43 had trained more than 1,000 naval personnel and supported the training of more than 22,000 soldiers in amphibious operations, was closed in August 1944 and its personnel transferred to the Cairns ATC. Distance continued to be an issue as the battlefront moved rapidly forward in 1943 and 44. As such, the main ATC at Toorbul Point was moved to Milne Bay in January of 1944, and from there to Luzon in the Philippines in June of 45. The establishment of the Amphibious Training Group and its component parts, the Amphibious Training Centres and Mobile Training Teams, created the ability to undertake proper collective training. This was done extensively in 1943 with the 9th Australian Division in the lead up to the assaults on Lae and Finschhafen. Lessons from these operations, as well as those gleaned from other Allied operations around the globe, led to the establishment of beach groups, which included 4 Royal Australian Navy beach commandos. The 1st Australian Beach Group was formed in December of 43 and the RAN Beach Commandos in January of 44. In November of 1944, the 4 commandos were grouped together as an RAN beach unit under Commander R.S. Pearson, becoming the Senior Naval Officer Beach Unit, or the SNOBU. With key personnel in place, an organisation, command and control system established, and an approach to training and doctrine secured, the platform for success in amphibious warfare in the theatre was laid. This organisation proved to be remarkably adaptive and innovative. And as more United States Navy equipment and ships became available in the theatre in 1945, eventually the doctrine evolved to resemble that of the US Marine Corps and US Navy in the Central Pacific. And the 1st Australian Corps, supported by the RANs, LSIs and beach commandos, would conduct the final assault of the Second World War in Borneo using the frontal assault amphibious operation mechanisms of those of the Central Pacific that the US Marines had pioneered. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. The next speaker is Dr. Karl James.
Thank you, Peter and Peter. Now, in the morning of the 1st of July 1945, hundreds of warships and vessels from the United States Navy, the Royal Australian Navy and the Royal Netherlands Navy lay off the coast of Balikpapan, an oil refining centre on Borneo's southeast coast. Now, this offensive to land the veteran 7th Australian Division was the largest amphibious operation ever conducted by Australian forces during the Second World War. Within an hour, some 16,500 troops were ashore and pushing inland, and more than 1,000 vehicles had been landed. Now, Balikpapan is often cited as an example of the expertise achieved by Australian forces in amphibious warfare during the Second World War. It was a remarkable development. 4 years earlier, the capability of Australia, or even the United States, to conduct amphibious operations in the Southwest Pacific area was limited, if not non-existent. Now, my paper this morning will briefly outline the development and some of the challenges amphibious operations in the Southwest Pacific area as they experienced by the Australians and the Americans during the Second World War. Now, the Southwest Pacific Theatre, the Southwest Pacific area, was a vast theatre. It included Australia, Papua New Guinea, the Netherlands East Indies, so now modern-day Indonesia, the Philippines, and it was all under the command of the Allied General Douglas MacArthur. Now, between the 22nd of June 1943 and the 12th of July 1945, the United States-led Allied forces conducted more than 60 major amphibious landings in the theatre, and the RAN participated in half of these operations. Now, it's worthwhile pointing out there was actually the Japanese who conducted the first amphibious landings in this theatre, and they were initially successful, seizing Rabaul in New Britain and areas such as Timor in early 1942. And the Australian defenders of Port Moresby in Papua, for example, considered the greatest threat to their isolated outposts as actually coming from the Japanese amphibious landing and not an approach across the formidable Owen Stanley's range. Now, the Japanese had assembled a seaborne invasion force to assault Port Moresby, but the losses they suffered during the Battle of Coral Sea in May meant that this operation was not launched. And the Japanese likewise planned an amphibious landing for Midway Island in the Central Pacific, but here too they were checked in a major naval action in June. In late August, the Japanese conducted an unsuccessful amphibious landing at Milne Bay in Papua. The Japanese landed, they were able to reinforce their troops, and after a week-long battle, they were evacuated by sea, mainly at night. The Japanese air cover, though, was minimal. The Australian soldiers, by comparison, were quite well supported by the Royal Australian Air Force, particularly from the fighter bomber squadrons. And indeed, air support was proved to be the decisive factor in the Australian victory. Now, the aborted Japanese amphibious operations for Port Moresby and Midway and their defeat at Milne Bay demonstrate the first requirement for the successful conduct of amphibious operations, and mainly this is the local control of the sea and air. Now, as we've just heard from Pete, at the outbreak of the Pacific War, the Allies could not carry out amphibious operations in the Southwest Pacific. Initially, there was no suitable ships, landing craft, trained Army or Navy personnel, and training facilities or even instructors. Now, these requirements were addressed in time, but it was a gradual process in the Southwest Pacific area for the Allies to also had to compete for resources. Now, in addition to many of the needs and the internal steps and development that Pete Dean has just indicated in terms of growing its capacity, In January of 1943, Rear Admiral Daniel E. Uncle Dan Barbie arrived to assume command of what became the 7th Amphibious Force. Now, he was likely the US Navy's leading expert in amphibious warfare. Barbie was concerned with the development of amphibious materials, doctrine and training, and he was an excellent planner and organiser. At their first meeting in January of 1943, and what was a very one-sided conversation, MacArthur told Barbie about plans for future operations in New Guinea and against Rabaul, and how, in MacArthur's opinion, the reconquest of the Philippines had to be given priority over all other objectives. Your job, MacArthur said to Barbie, is to develop an amphibious force that can carry my troops in those campaigns. Now, the landings of the veteran 9th Australian Division in New Guinea, near Lae, and then later at Scarlet Beach at Knight and Finchhappen in September of 1943, were the first opposed landings conducted by Barbie's amphibious force. Conducted without air cover or prolonged naval bombardment, both Lae and Finchhappen were successful, although they were not without mishap and proved valuable learning lessons. Thereafter, the Allied landings took place in New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, New Britain, and then on into the Netherlands East Indies. Then, as probably now, these regions presented their own unique geographical challenges. There are very few developed harbours in New Guinea, and many of the waterways were either or poorly charted. Beaches were narrow, and in many areas, coral shelves extended beyond the beach, and there was an abundance of thick reefs. Thick jungle too approached the water's edge. This, along with soft or swampy ground inland, complicated beach clearances and the dispersal of vehicles and stores. The jungle too made it difficult to identify Japanese defences and fortifications. So aerial photographs proved to be quite effective in determining the nature of beaches, the approaches, as well as the neighbouring terrain. Now, in 1943, Barbie's fleet relied upon beaching type ships, so large landing ship tanks, landing craft infantry and landing craft personnel. Shore-based air support was not always guaranteed, and the naval gunfire support was limited, mainly to destroyers. So Barbie consequently chose lightly defended beaches for an assault, and also had a reliance on surprise. Now, these beaching ships were also used both for the assault as well as reinforcing. So all these operations had to be done quite quickly. And so Barbie developed a series of rules that still seem relevant today. He insisted upon thorough training, simple language in operational orders, landing where the Japanese were not, and continuous air and sea coverage, as well as a quick unloading of only those equipment and stores that are absolutely essential. Now, by 1944, the Allies had far greater material as well as power, or the projection of power, in the Southwest Pacific, and were dominating the sea and the air. The decryption of the Japanese codes too, and ultra-intelligence, meant that MacArthur could conduct his spectacular series of bypassing leaps, confident in his knowledge of the local Japanese dispositions and strengths. Now, ever present at these landings were the Australian LSIs, or the landing ship infantries, so HMAS Manoora, West Australia and Canimbla. Now, these Australian landing ships were crucial to the Allied operations in 1944 and 1945, and yet these ships and their companies have really received scant attention. Originally built and operated as civilian passenger liners, following the outbreak of war, Manoora, West Australia and Canimbla were commissioned into the RAN as armed merchant cruisers. And then in late 1942 and into 1943, the three ships were converted into landing ships. The larger guns were removed and replaced by landing craft and scrambling nets. The wooden panelling was replaced by galvanised iron sheeting, and all the available space was converted for the carrying of troops and stores. Once fitted with the American pattern messing, Manoora, for example, could carry some 1,200 soldiers and carry between 20 or 22 landing craft vehicle personnel, so LCVPs, and 2 or 3 landing craft mechanised. Another contribution made by the RAN to amphibious operations in the Southwest Pacific was the RAN Beach Commandos. So these men were specialists who were trained in assaulting techniques and had responsibility for controlling the successive ways of landing craft. They essentially helped organise the beachhead, and they worked directly with the Australian Army and liaised with the US Navy. Established along the same lines as the Royal Navy Beach Commandos, the RAM Beach Commandos were formed in 1944 to work with the Army's two beach groups. An RAM Beach Commando consisted of 120 officers and ratings, and they included the beach masters, the beach parties, a repair and recovery section, and a naval beach signal section. And in addition to their seamanship skills and local and boat and landing craft handling, these sailors also received infantry training, such as patrolling techniques, and as well as demolitions, and they're also instructed on how to drive different types of vehicles, such as jeeps, tractors, as well as ducks, so large amphibious vehicles. Now, during the war, the Australian Army also developed its own water transport capability. In September of 1942, the Directorate of Water Transport (small craft) was raised, with this responsibility sitting with the Royal Australian Engineers. Now, during 1945, these landing craft companies and small ships companies were also used to conduct small amphibious operations in New Guinea as well as Bougainville. Now, these operations were modest affairs when compared to the operations in Borneo, for example, and they were shore-to-shore operations rather than ship-to-shore. Now, these smaller activities, based on company-sized groups, really warrant further study. In North Bougainville, for example, with no roads and only narrow foot tracks, the only way to regularly supply the Australian campaign in the north was by the sea. The movement of troops, guns, stores and ammunition, as well as evacuation of the wounded, all had to be done by sea. And in this area, in March of 1945, the militia's 26th Battalion, with the 42nd Landing Craft Company, operating Australian Landing Craft 15, so there's Australian-made landing craft, as well as landing craft assaults, conducted a series of amphibious operations to outflank, bypass and cut the Japanese lines of communications in the Sorokon Peninsula. Described as a brilliant series of manoeuvres, the Australians forced the Japanese to abandon one position after another. Now, the Japanese had laced the Bonis Peninsula with pillboxes and bunkers aside many tracks and roads. And to overcome these intimidating defences, another amphibious operation was planned, or was devised, where a small force would land by barge at Portland Plantation and push inland to link up with the main Australian infantry force moving north. Early on the 8th of June, a force based around the 31st 51st Battalion's A Company, so 190 officers and men, landed at Porton. They established a small perimeter, but one of the barges carrying the heavy weapons became grounded offshore on a reef, and within 50 minutes, the Australians were coming under fire from the Japanese, from machine gun fire. By dawn, it was clear that the perimeter was ringed by Japanese pillboxes. The Japanese were on all sides, controlling the approaches to the beach. Only accurate Australian artillery firing from Sorokon prevented the Japanese from overrunning the beachhead. The Japanese pressure continued to tighten. Attempts to reinforce the Australians during the night by sea were abandoned when the Australian landing craft came under heavy machine gun fire, and eventually a decision was made to evacuate the force. The rescuing landing craft broke through to the beach to evacuate the Australians late in the afternoon. Overloaded, 3 landing craft became grounded. 1 floated off, but 2 remained stuck. And then low-flying RAAF aircraft, as well as the ongoing artillery support, tried to protect those men trapped in their landing craft, but they still came under fire from the Japanese. Now, during the night, one of the stranded craft was able to drift off. Finally, in the early hours of 11th of June, the survivors were rescued and brought back to Sorokon. Of the 190 men who made the initial assault, 22 were killed or wounded, 22 were killed or missing, and 62 were wounded. More were hospitalised. 5 more men were killed from the rescuing landing craft company, and 7 were wounded. Now, the planning for Portland was rushed. Mistakes were made at all levels. And although landing behind the Japanese had worked successfully at Sorokon, the Australians were pushing their luck to trying these tactics again. The reefs made the seaborne approach to Porton dangerous, and their force was too small to establish a beachhead and push inland. By daylight, the Japanese had already gained control of the approaches to the beach, making it impossible to unload the stores on the grounded barge or to land reinforcements. Now, the Australian defeat was also due to the failure of the infantry force to break through and link up with the Australians at Porton. So just to conclude, much of the fighting in the South Pacific area during 1942 and 1943 was conducted by the Army and the Air Forces in grinding attritional assaults in Papua New Guinea, with the Allies responding to or reacting against the Japanese. In late 1943, General MacArthur went on the offensive, and it was the Allied navies, with the development of amphibious warfare, that enabled this advance. Allied operations became larger and the tempo of operations increased. The US-led invasions of Leyte, Lingayen Gulfs in the Philippines in October 1944 and January 1945 were vast undertakings. The Australian landings in Borneo in May and through to July 1945 were, at the time, and will likely remain, the largest amphibious operations ever conducted by Australian forces. Now, the development and application of amphibious warfare in 1944 and 45, when combined with the Allied dominance over the Japanese at sea, in the air, and through intelligence, offered MacArthur the ability to manoeuvre his Allied forces and transport large numbers of troops, vehicles and stores across the vast theatre of the Southwest Pacific. No longer would it be necessary for MacArthur's troops to make frontal assaults on skillfully prepared positions, Vice Admiral Barbie later wrote. From now on, enemy strong points could be bypassed and Allied troops landed on lightly defended beaches of our own choosing. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Karl. And now we hear about logistics from Dr. Rhys Crawley.
Thank you. I'm going with the iPad for the first time ever at a conference, so this could end up as a disaster, really, but we'll see how we go. The inherent difficulties of amphibious logistics, of getting men and material from one location to another, often across a hostile shore and then forward to disperse troops and then sustaining them, would be familiar to anyone with even the slightest passing interest in military history. On top of all of these complexities, we should add those of working in a joint environment with more than one service, or as part of a coalition, with everyone having their own lexicon and their own way of working. In the time I have today, I'll briefly examine some of the logistic developments up to 1945, and then the logistic planning and preparations for Obo 1, the amphibious assault at Tarakan on the 1st of May 1945. As we've heard, Australian amphibious doctrine was found wanting at the outbreak of the Pacific War, and this extended to logistics. There was only limited practice in loading and unloading men and supplies from amphibious craft prior to Operation Postern, the September 1943 assault on Lae. That landing went well, but once ashore, the limitations of their preparations and training became evident. The division found that it had completely miscalculated its logistic requirements in the beachhead. Troops from a pioneer battalion and 2 infantry battalions had to be diverted from operations to help with the unloading of ships. The beachhead was congested, and supplies of food, ammunition and fuel remained intermixed and stacked close to the shore. Japanese aircraft destroyed fuel and ammunition dumps, and they could have done a lot worse with a bit more luck. Many of the same issues hindered the next assault on Finschhafen a few days later. Of the 35 lessons identified by the 9th Division as stemming from Lae and Finschhafen, nearly half dealt with logistics. Training, as we heard from Professor Dean, had been deficient. In future, the supply and transport elements should undertake specialised training in loading and unloading supplies in the same type of craft to be used in an operation, and they should practice establishing stockpiles and constructing roads from the beaches into the jungle. Both operations reiterated that success relied on familiarisation and that this would only come through training and experience. The main logistic lessons were to be found on the beachheads. Beach organisation, congestion and forward supply could all be improved by better preparation and the formation of specialised units. There was also a need for additional labour, vehicles and small craft in order to free up troops for operations. Specifically, a self-contained beach landing group was deemed a necessity for work on the beaches. This would eliminate the situation as experienced at Lae, where the 9th Division had to provide the staff to work the beach maintenance area. It would also free up personnel for the quick preparation of beach exits and the formation of supply dumps, both essential elements in reducing congestion and clearing stores from the beach, where, as we've heard, they were vulnerable and more vulnerable to air attack. The most significant logistic reform stemming from these lessons was the formation of the 1st Australian Beach Group in November of 1943 and the 2nd Australian Beach Group in May of 1944. Each, as we've heard, numbered 1,800 personnel and consisted of Army troops, a Royal Australian Navy Beach Commando, and a large collection of logistic units including engineers, signallers, medical staff, Army Service Corps personnel and Ordnance and Provo units. Its role was to facilitate the landing by unloading the landing craft, clearing the beach, liaising with the fighting forces and administering the beachhead. Longer-term logistic support beyond the initial landing, when a base was up and running, became the responsibility of base sub-areas, another new organisation formed in 1944. This is a familiar map. I think we all ripped it out of one of Pete's books. The most significant logistic... Oh, done that one. This is why you stick to paper. Although the idea had existed since 1944, detailed planning for the amphibious assaults to liberate Borneo, codenamed Operation Oboe, began after MacArthur's GHQ issued orders in March of 1945. After a series of postponements, most of which were due to a shortage of shipping to move units from Australia to the staging base at Moritai, GHQ settled on 3 operations in 3 stages. So Oboe 1, a landing by the 26th Infantry Brigade Group of the 9th Division at Tarakan on the 1st of May, Oboe 6 by the remainder of the 9th Division at Labuan Island and Brunei Bay on the 10th of June, and Oboe 2 by the 7th Division at Balikpapan on the 1st of July. Each operation had a similar objective: to seize and destroy all the enemy forces in the area, thus allowing the area to be used as a naval and air base for future operations, and, where possible, to re-establish civil government. Training, which had been underway since mid-1944, was as realistic as possible and included loading assault craft, landing the force, developing a beachhead and delivering hundreds of tonnes of stores ashore. The 1st and 2nd Australian Beach Groups were an integral part of this. Logistics underpinned the entire planning and preparation process for these operations. After consulting with the relevant division, the 1st Australian Corps issued a maintenance project for each operation. This maintenance project was the Force Commander's administrative order and defined the logistic considerations for the operation. Crucially, it established the key dates and clarified who, including which service, was responsible for each component of supply, resupply and the ongoing maintenance of the force. In each of the Oboe operations, the Commander Allied Land Forces was responsible for providing the necessary supplies from Australia and equipment from Australia. The Divisional Commander was responsible for loading the assault convoy at Moritai, and the Commander Allied Naval Forces was then responsible for transporting the assault forces and their initial supplies from the staging base to the objective area. Commander US Army Services of Supply was to provide bulk storage for ammunition and petroleum, including a floating reserve of each, and all transport for the resupply of the force. Troop movements from Australia to Moritai began on the 12th of March and continued at 6,000 to 7,000 troops plus vehicles, equipment and stores per week. By the time that the 7th and 9th Divisions departed Australia, they had been equipped to a level never previously achieved by an Australian formation. Moritai, the staging base for all 3 Oboe operations, was a hive of activity and hard work in preparation for the embarkation of the assault convoys. These ships, mostly provided by the US Navy, although with the Royal Australian Navy ships involved, would either run ashore or, in the case of Tarakan, offload using naval pontoons and amphibious craft at the landing beaches. They therefore had to be tactically loaded so as to enable fast disembarkation by the beach groups and for their quick return to Morotai for resupply purposes. To give you a sense of how logistics played out in the Borneo operations, let me briefly explain what happened at Tarakan, the first of those operations. It is important to note that each of the OBO operations differed in the logistic challenges faced and the strength of the enemy opposition encountered. All were tactically successful, yet strategically dubious, but the roles of the logisticians were similar despite the changing circumstances. The landing at Tarakan on the 1st of May 1945 was successful. Beach parties of the 2nd Australian Beach Group landed with the initial waves, performed reconnaissance and, as per their duties, marked out the beaches. The assault craft and some landing craft mechanised, or LCMs, succeeded in reaching the shore. 7 of the 20 LSTs, landing ship tank, of the assault convoy carrying cargo were called into the shore 90 minutes after the first landings, but beached 60 yards from the shore. They remained there stuck in the mud until the next spring tide 10 days later. Within 20 minutes, and despite the current, 2 of the beached LSTs were connected to the shore by pontoon causeways. Insufficient men for labour, both on the beaches and at the dumps, proved to be the greatest individual problem according to the beach group. This was exacerbated by not knowing which LSTs would land first or where, and therefore not being able to allocate labour in advance. A lack of beach exits, combined with the difficulties of getting stores ashore, delayed the beach group's work in both clearing the amphibious craft, developing the beach maintenance area, sorting the mixture of stores and creating dumps. There was only really one road inland that was suitable for traffic. The others were either destroyed during the Allied bombardment or could not handle heavy vehicles. Once vehicles ventured off the road, they became bogged. In total, 75 vehicles had to be rescued from the Tarakan mud during the first 3 days, a great majority of which had become bogged or drowned because they were either overloaded or not waterproofed. Traffic control was another issue and proved to be particularly difficult due to the poor state of the roads and congestion. Initial transport from the beaches to the beach maintenance area was undertaken by the Beach Group General Transport Company, which in the first 2 weeks of operations transported 12,500 tonnes of stores from the beach to the dumps. The OBO operations, the largest amphibious operations in Australian military history, were the high watermark of Australian Army logistics, excuse me, and showed the Australians at their most logistically proficient. Where obstacles were faced, such as the difficulty of getting supplies ashore onto unsuitable beaches at Tarakan, the beach groups working with the fighting force overcame them through familiarisation, improvisation, cooperation and hard work. Overall, and despite many small problems, the OBO operations were a logistic success. The forces achieved their objectives and, while there were challenges, there were, with few exceptions, no real complaints about the lack of stores or supplies, either in the initial stages or while following up the Japanese forces as they retreated inland. The reason for this logistic success were many. Australian amphibious doctrine, as we've heard, came to understand the importance of logistics and recognised that logistic proficiency came through proper planning, preparation, training and exercises. Increased amphibious lift capabilities, enabled by the National Support Base, unprecedented US shipping support and air and sea control, meant that more troops and more supplies could be conveyed both to the staging base and the beaches than had hitherto been the case. Moreover, having learned the lessons of Lae, Finschhafen and a host of other amphibious operations in the European and Pacific theatres, the OBO operations saw the Australian beach groups employed for the first time. The results, although not perfect, confirmed how important it was to have a properly functioning beach maintenance area and adequate cooperation between the services, the need for flexible and adaptive logistics, and the necessary labour and transport to perform the tasks and achieve the objectives as defined by GHQ. Thank you.
Thanks, Rhys. I'd now like to conclude in terms of presentations with mine, which is on lessons learned for the 21st century Navy. From the outset, it is important to appreciate, as we've seen in these the previous presentations, that amphibious operations do not just involve getting troops to shore. They involve, among other things, operational level planning, intelligence assessments, task group command, precursor operations such as reconnaissance, hydrography and mine clearance, protection of the amphibious force in transit and in the sustainment phase, shore bombardment and air and anti-submarine protection in the lodgement area. During World War II, the REN did all of these things, but in some of the amphibious operations that were involved in the Pacific, they just did some elements of them. By the end of World War II, the REN had demonstrated an adeptness at joint and combined operations, including amphibious operations that it hitherto not shown and would be the benchmark for all future operations. In particular, I would argue that the performance of the REN squadron in the Philippines campaign was its finest hour. In looking at the performance of the Australian squadron, it's important to look at its experience in World War II, and it's a case of the journey it took is as instructive as its final destination in the OBO operations and at the Philippines. We therefore have to start with the amphibious operations in Guadalcanal and Tulagi in August 1942 and the crushing defeat in the Battle of Savo Island. In that night action, the US lost 3 heavy cruisers and the REN lost HMAS Canberra. Time does not allow a detailed analysis of that operation, which after the Savo Island battle led to the withdrawal of the Allied naval force from the lodgement area, leaving the US Marines to their own devices. What is relevant to us is the Battle of Savo Island demonstrated the Australian Naval Squadron was a force that, while it could seamlessly operate with the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean and European waters, it could not do so with the US Navy in the vast expanse of the Pacific. The REN lacked the necessary radio communications. At that time, the Americans were just introducing a line of sight communications called talk between ships. The ships lacked the range and endurance for Pacific operations and the ability to conduct alongside replenishment. They had insufficient refrigerated food storage. They did not have a supporting logistics support force. The ships did not have air conditioning and the habitability features suitable for the tropics, and they had inadequate anti-aircraft guns. Tactically, the squadron lacked the compatibility with the US Navy. It did not have an easy mechanism to share experiences of REN units between, say, in the Mediterranean, where there was a lot of experience with air attack and how to sustain ships in action or defence watches, with other ships in other theatres. And it did not have a good unit and task group training regime. Operationally, the Admiral's staff of personnel was grossly inadequate to plan and execute task group operations. Rear Admiral Crutchley in the Guadalcanal campaign had no more than 4 dedicated staff. Defeat in a war is a harsh teacher. To the enduring credit of Crutchley and his successors, Commodore John Collins and Commodore Harold Farncombe, they set about a root and branch reform of the Australian Naval Squadron, and they were supported back home from Navy Office and indeed the government. So what did the REN do to address their clear deficiencies for the Pacific War? Fortunately, post the Battle of Savo Island, there was an operational pause which allowed the main ships of the squadron to be refitted and to train. The REN cruisers Australia, Hobart and the destroyers Arunta and Warramunga would form the nucleus of the Allied Task Force 74 that would include US cruisers and destroyers. The REN ships were all fitted with talk between ships. Voice procedures were adjusted to conform to the USN. So, for example, instead of saying naught, you said 0. the formations that the US adopted for screens and so on, the REN adopted. The task group commander staff progressively grew to the mid-20s in number. Importantly, there were officers and sailors for watchkeeping, planning, logistics. There was Army and Air Force liaison officers, as well as engineering and logistics specialists. While the ship's ranges remained an issue, ships were modified and became adept at alongside replenishment. In 1943, the requisitioned HMAS McCurr and Po Yang were converted to victualling, issuing and ammunition ships respectively. They were later augmented by HMAS Malkra and Yunnan, and HMAS Wang Pu was used as a repair and depot ship. These ships helped improve logistics, but the lack of refrigerated spaces on board meant, as I'm sure Guy Griffiths can attest, to much eating of tin bully beef in the squadron. In terms of weapons and sensors, there was a vast improvement. Importantly, radars were fitted for air detection, fighter control, surface detection and gunnery fire control. These were generally of UK origin, and the Type 291 air search radar would arguably prove to be the best performing air search radar in the Philippines campaign. Most of the pre-war anti-aircraft weapons did not have the range and stopping power to counter modern aircraft, and in particular kamikazes. In the early years of the war, 20mm guns started to proliferate on board ships, but these too proved inadequate in late Gulf. Famously, between later Gulf and Lingayen Gulf battles, Shropshire's gunnery officer, Lieutenant Commander Warwick Bracegirdle, who you see there, was able, for the price of some wardroom whiskey, to obtain 13 40mm Bofors from the Americans in Manus Island to bolster the ship's defences. Shropshire was also fitted in her initial refit when she was handed over to the Australians with a radar-equipped anti-aircraft directors for each 8-inch gun turret. Bracegirdle had conceived the idea of firing time mechanical fused 8-inch rounds set to explode at 3,000 yards from the ship as both a destructive and a deterrent weapon. Finally, the forward deployed REN Ordnance Branch was able to certify some of the US 8-inch rounds for the REN heavy cruisers. These rounds were both superior and of course more plentiful in theatre. We've heard from the earlier speakers about the importance of the landing ship infantry and all the attendant training and doctrine that made these such a valuable asset, both in the squadron and also to the Allied effort. Hydrography was also a vital element of the amphibious operations, both in terms of providing marker buoys and navigation marks for the approaching amphibious force, and also for beach survey. A number of frigates, such as Gascoigne here, and corvettes and motor launchers were all modified for this work. Coast Watchers are amongst the most decorated of REN organisations, particularly for their intelligence gathering work in the Solomons campaign. What is less appreciated is that some Coast Watchers, because of their superior bush skills and local knowledge, were also used in intelligence gathering for some amphibious operations, as you see here. I'd just like now to finish by commenting on one commander and two ships. The commander is Commodore Harold Farncombe, and the two ships are the heavy cruisers Australia and Shropshire. Harold Farncombe is, I believe, the REN's finest task group commander. He demonstrated great professional competence and bravery in the Battle of Lingayen Gulf, but importantly for this discussion, he demonstrated the importance of the task group commander helping those at the strategic level at home calibrate and prioritise the REN contribution to the Allied war effort. So as an example, they had what was called speed letters, which were essentially in signal form a letter which could be sent back home. And he, as an example, emphasised the importance of getting Hobart, which had been torpedoed, to be refitted, and that was the number one priority to come up, because that was going to make a contribution to the war effort more than, say, some of the smaller ships. He seized also on the need to adequately logistically support the force, and many of his ideas, such as air logistics and personnel transfer by air, are now commonplace. He also went to great lengths to ensure ships joining the force were adequately prepared, and that wherever that ship was going into the Allied force, that their commander was briefed on the capabilities and limitations of the joining Australian ship. The bravery demonstrated by HMAS Australia's Ships Company in stoically operating their ship in the face of 6 kamikaze attacks highlights the intense stress a ship can be placed under. In the face of all this, the cruiser continued to provide fire support ashore. I believe HMAS Shropshire is only rivalled by HMAS Sydney in the Mediterranean as being our finest ship of the war. On entering service with the REN, she had a very comprehensive upgrade, particularly with her radar suite. Her commissioning crew were diverse, both in terms of permanent and hostilities-only personnel. She did have an outstanding leadership team of officers and senior sailors. Her peerless performance in air detection and gunnery in the Philippines campaign was in part due, according to her captain, Captain Godfrey Nichols, that the fact that she had a stable ship's company that for at least 6 months before the operations in the Philippines had not had any significant posting movement. The REN's involvement in the Philippines campaign looks a lot like some of the REN's deployments in more recent wars. By that I mean it provided a composite task group, it had a task group commander who had a coalition task group role, and some of the units stayed within that task group, others went to, in the case of the landing ship infantry, went to other formations. And certainly Iraq in 2003 is a similar sort of example. So it's not surprising that there are lessons, and this is what I think are the lessons for the 21st century Navy. The need to have an overall concept of operations that is comprehensive and resourced. Ships need to be designed for their operational environment and be upgraded if necessary, sometimes in theatre based on war experience. Doctrine, tactics and procedures need to be reviewed and changed to counter those of the enemy threat. And in the Philippines campaign, the advent of the kamikaze, which was first shown in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, is an example of how they had to come up with some different tactics. Logistics is a key enabler, and that the REN has to be able to sustain its task group when it's deployed. This may require requisitioned or chartered merchant shipping. Relevant and tailored training, both individual and collective, is essential. Finally, in wartime, personnel need considerable stores of resilience and the cohesion of a well-founded ship's company to fight and win at sea. Thank you. So we now have questions, and we'll have them. So first off, to Professor Peter Dean, what are your thoughts on the applicability for the Indian Ocean theatre of amphibious operations as seen in the Pacific?
Very relevant. So there was quite what I didn't have time to go into, became quite a sophisticated system in Australia from both the Navy and the Army on taking on lessons learned. That was not only in terms of the lessons learned from the operations that or lessons observed, I should say, not always learned, but from not only the operations we were involved in, but all operations that were happening both in the Central Pacific Theatre, in the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean, and Europe as well. So there's a very sophisticated system with liaison officers and also military missions coming out from the UK, and also cross personnel exchanges with the Central Pacific Commands. And so when you look into the records of the different headquarters units that were established, they're constantly reading what's coming out of the latest operation in the Mediterranean or the Central Pacific. and trying to figure out if that's relevant to them. And certainly there was a lot of planning in 1945 for potential operations into the Indian Ocean through the Southeast Asia Command, through Burma. Many of these operations were not undertaken because the war finished or because resources were reallocated. But certainly in the Southeast Asian Command, Mountbatten argued very vigorously for a long period of time when the 1st Australian Corps and most was out of operations in 1944, that MacArthur wasn't using the Australians, either our Navy or our Army properly, and basically Mountbatten wanted them, because what he realised he would get if he got them was a 3-division amphibious and jungle warfare trained corps and a whole fleet that had been supporting such operations. So there was a great tussle amongst the High Command. So by that stage there was lots of relevant lessons being learned in all the different theatres and shared.
And you've got another one, which is what assistance or involvement did the US Marine Corps have in amphibious training?
So early on, when they're first trying to figure out what they're going to do in 1942, we get a couple of US Marine Corps officers to come and share some lessons learned. Obviously the US 1st Marine Division comes to Australia, to Melbourne, after the Guadalcanal campaign, and there's a couple of trial operations with the first US AKA amphibious assault ship that turns up with Barbie's force, and a couple of the new landing craft that's practiced in Melbourne a couple of times. Obviously that Marine Division also lands with the 7th Amphibious Force at Cape Gloucester later in the campaign, so there's certainly a sprinkling. And when Barbie arrives, he brings with him not just himself, but a whole series of trained staff officers. He could never get enough. His big thing he had to realise is he had to have 2 staffs, one for current ops and one for future ops, and that's how Ronald Hopkins ended up commanding one of the planning teams. But wherever possible, he was borrowing officers where he could from the US Marines in the Central Pacific, and the US Navy was transferring officers between the 2 commands to sort of share the lessons learned. The big difference was, of course, the geography and the types of operations. So what they did at Guadalcanal was very similar to the Southwest Pacific and Cape Gloucester, but that's very different to the type of operations at Tarawa and then later on at Saipan, Okinawa and Iwo Jima. And the key thing was to try and figure out what lesson was applicable for the circumstances and the context of what the next operation was going to be about. So some things they took on board and realised that didn't work. Other things they went, that's not going to be relevant, and later on found out actually that would have been a really good thing to do. So that movement of officers was quite good. It was problematic because of inter-service rivalry, and it was problematic because of the particular service's view. So the 1st Marine Division was very keen to get back to the Central Pacific with the rest of the Marines and back with the Navy and away from MacArthur and an Army commander. And of course, the Central Pacific fleet under Nimitz were very reluctant to give MacArthur any resources whatsoever. So MacArthur spent years bagging the Australian Army in particular, but also our Navy, and I'm convinced not because he didn't like us, it's because there was no strategic advantage for him to say, these Australians are great, because then the US forces back in the US and in the Central Pacific would say, well, okay, we don't need to send you any additional US troops or any US ships or aircraft. So he was constantly saying we will B grade, I'm convinced, because what he was advocating for was more resources for his theatre.
Okay. Karl, James, you've got an easy one. How do you view the evolving challenges and threats in Australia's area of operations as compared to those in the past?
Yeah, not exactly quite the same. I think in many ways it's quite interesting. So historically, in some ways I don't think you really can compare. It's likely that Australia's operations in the future in the Pacific, say in our near neighbours, will be smaller operations, probably more to do with humanitarian, not necessarily peacekeeping, more humanitarian support. And I think there's possibly the advantage of looking and studying at those smaller levels of amphibious operations, so the Army Engineers operations, because they're operating in, say, New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and it's a similar sort of environment. I don't think it's likely. Historians are really bad at predicting the future, but I do think it's unlikely that we'd need to see a large-scale major amphibious operation. So I don't think we'll ever see another Balikpapan in our region. I certainly hope that we don't.
Okay, thanks for that. One for you, Rhys. What percentage of successful amphibious operations is effective naval gunfire support? What percentage of successful amphibious?
Yeah, I might need to defer to my colleagues on this. Certainly, the area I'm most familiar with naval gunfire support is its support or lack thereof of the Gallipoli campaigns in the First World War, and its inability to hit anything it was intended to hit, through a whole range of technical and personnel issues, as well as just not understanding fall of shot and terrain and that. But for these operations, I don't know, have you gents got anything to add?
Yeah, so I think there's a really good example of what happens when you don't use it. So there's a very, very little known operation off Goodenough Island in 1942. So when the Milne Bay operation happens and the Japanese land their amphibious force at Milne Bay, a bunch of Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces troops are marooned on Goodenough Island when their landing craft are destroyed by the RAAF. And the Australians and Americans are worried that this force might form a staging point for a further assault on Milne Bay, or that they might use the opportunity to develop Goodenough Island as a forward air base, which would be really dangerous. So they decide to conduct an amphibious raid to remove that force. And they pick out an Australian infantry battalion from Milne Bay. Its sole reason it's chosen is its commander does the first ever course at Jutes in Port Stephens. He does a 2-week course in amphibious operations. He's the sole person with some amphibious training. He's put together with HMAS Arunta and another destroyer, and they decide to plan this raid. And when they do this, it's basically a sea lift operation rather than a really amphibious operation. So they've got a very powerful Australian destroyer on presence, and there's no regard for naval gunfire support. And because it's very heavy jungle terrain, the infantry battalion commander decides not to take anything, even his mortars, into the initial assault. And of course they run into heavily defended Japanese in deep bunkers that have been preparing for weeks while they've been stranded on the island. And sitting offshore is 2 Australian destroyers, and there's no ability to do naval gunfire support. And it's an absolute disaster because no one actually considers it, there's no planning for it, and it shows you how far you go then when you get to Tarakan, for instance, where there's thousands of tons of ammunition dropped on the Japanese, and the naval gunfire support and air support is so proficient that at Balikpapan, the Australian divisional commander looks at his plan and goes, it will be cheaper in terms of casualties to land on top of the Japanese forces under this umbrella of firepower than it will to land on a position away and then manoeuvre onto the objective. So it actually will reduce casualties because of the size of and capability of the naval gunfire support to land on the objective. So that's the first one to the last one is a massive move in only a 3-year period.
And partly that's a combination of air power and sea power too, because in one of those, particularly in Borneo for Tarakan and also Balikpapan, Balikpapan is a little bit of a case in point. Yes, the Japanese defences were very strong, but part of the reason there was an air and sea bombardment for more than 3 weeks is because of the question marks around its necessity. So there's a lot of doubt as to whether or not Balikpapan needed to take place, should it take place, and yes, there was hesitancy as to the strength of the fortifications. So MacArthur's reply is that, his answer to that question is then just to basically blow Balikpapan out of the water essentially. Massive air and sea bombardment lasts for 3 weeks. It's huge. The challenge, though, for the Australians at Balikpapan as well as Tarakan and other areas is that once the US Navy and the Australian Navy moves on to the next operation, you still have fairly long, slow, dragging assaults and campaigns that drag on for many weeks. So Tarakan, for example, the shore is bombarded, blown to pieces. Once the Australian brigade moves inland, you still have another 6 weeks of very intense fighting. So it's great to get that naval gunfire support is key to getting the soldiers onto the ground or onto the shore. Then once they move inland, then it's sort of another case in point because the whole amphibious show moves on to the next one. And the challenge Australian forces have in the Second World War, 1945, is that we're operating 6 separate campaigns from New Guinea, Bougainville, as well as the 3 operations on Borneo. So it's really key and important, but it's just one element of a multifaceted approach.
Okay, thanks Rhys. You've got another one. In an age of increasing interoperability and collaboration between regional partners, how might the lessons learned in World War II be applied to modern landings?
Yeah, I think some of the themes that have come out in all of the papers today are the keys of familiarisation and training and exercising and understanding each other's approaches to these operations. It's a constant work in progress. So one of the things that strikes me, I think, and I've only really dipped my toe into the Second World War, is the extent to which commands were producing lessons learned papers. Again, whether they're learning them or not is a different matter, but we certainly see them implementing components of those. And I think I certainly hoped to try and take people on a journey of that. That was occurring to an extent that I'm not sure is occurring today. My current job is writing the official history of Afghanistan, and I'm not seeing the sorts of papers produced in Afghanistan that I'm seeing when I look back in the Second World War archive. So there's a constant need to progress, for progress, and you can do as much as you can in exercises, but battle's also going to enable people to learn a lot quicker. So I'd hazard a guess to say we're nowhere near where we were in 1945, but many of the difficulties will be the same, even if the scale is not the same. If we look at what Karl says, there's logistic cycles that are important to consider, and the lessons that come from that is the need for a national support base. And there's a current debates. I think I saw Admiral Barry in the audience earlier, but there's current debates here on oil vulnerability and sea line vulnerability. There's less shipping than there was. We don't have the United States in 1944-45 providing anything to move anything, really. So there's lessons that we need to consider, that our Defence Force needs to be considering if it isn't already, that our politicians need to be considering. And then there's the difficulties, the tactical difficulties of getting people and things ashore. You're vulnerable on a beach. You're particularly vulnerable on a beach if it hasn't been bombarded with thousands of tons of ordnance beforehand. There's cyber intrusions that are going to make a highly technical force vulnerable. The ability to communicate on those beaches was key. We learn that and we see that, and that comes through training and exercising together. So there's a whole range of lessons that come out of that. But as a historian, I tend to not try and think of the lessons, because that's the people in this audience. That's your job to hopefully look at what we do for some nuance, and then pick out the things that you need and learn to apply that. But I'm happy to open that up if anyone else has got anything else.
I just want to follow up one thing. So, what happens at Balikpapan and Borneo is amazing, but it's with air and sea superiority, not control superiority. But I think another important lesson to take is the Goodenough Island operation. It's tactically a disaster, not a disaster, but it's tactically very poor. Operationally and strategically, it's very important. We do remove the Japanese from that island. That island becomes then an Allied fort operating base, and becomes very important for the projection of air power into the region. That's done in a completely contested environment. So those two Australian destroyers are operating with a Japanese light cruiser nearby and with contested air cover during the entire period of time. At Lae in 1943, as Karl pointed out, this is contested airspace. So we are extraordinarily lucky that the Japanese come along and bomb the beach, and half their bombs fall in between the landing ship tanks lined up along the shore. Two of them hit. In one, most of the significant casualty happened. An Australian battalion commander is killed, most of his staff, and a significant number of the troops. So these are operations, many of them early on, in contested space. The notion that we're only ever going to do amphibious operations with sea and air superiority, I think, is a fallacy. And people say because of anti-access area denial stuff, we won't do that anymore. The islands to our north have not changed. The politics have changed, but the geography hasn't changed. If you have to operate in that space and you want to do manoeuvre warfare, you have to use the ocean as the manoeuvre space. And you're going to have to do that sometime in semi-contested or fully contested spaces, preferably with some level of sea control, at least temporary sea control in that space. And I think those early operations and the smaller ones are really key too. So after Lae, the 7th Amphibious Force sails off into the distance, and the big thing the Australian Army learns is, oh shit, the ships are gone. And so as they're slogging through the jungle, they realise, well, this is a really bad way. If only we had some craft to put our tanks and troops on to go around the Japanese defences. And they eventually do that, losing the landing craft. And that's the big lesson they learn, which leads to the Army having 600 vessels of its own to operate by 1945. So that tactical manoeuvre is also really key. So when the LHDs come along and drop the landing force off and the LHDs sail off to the next operation, there has to also be that riverine capability or coastal craft capability to support those operations. I mean, one of my great regrets is we got lovely LHDs, and funnily enough, I'm a big fan of them, being an amphibious warfare aficionado, but the Balikpapan class are gone, and we haven't really replaced something like that. And the Army needs to develop a greater riverine capability as well to go along with it.
Okay, one for me. Should Australia have one landing force capable of operations anywhere, or different landing forces designed for different theatres and optimised to collaborate with different partners? So my view is you have one, but they've got to be enough flexibility and enough breadth of understanding to be able to operate in different areas and with different partners. How do you achieve that? Part of it is timely insertion into the area of operations. And our biggest successes tend to be where we operate earlier in areas. That's a feature that navies, I think, generally have that advantage anyway. So just to go back to my experience in Iraq, is the fact that the Navy operated in the Gulf for many years, and following on Rhys's point, the fact that every deployment, the ships were getting a different tailored workup from Sea Training Group based on changes in initially it was sanctions enforcement, but the key takeaway there is that you're making sure that the ships are trained to go into that area, but also you have the flexibility to do doctrine. So take Peter's point, in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq, we had to develop riverine operations doctrine. Why? Because there was no riverine operations doctrine. How do we get the first development of it? Because we happened to have a staff officer who was old enough to have been in confrontation, and he wrote it. That was Lieutenant Commander Fred Ross, for those who remember him. But the point there is that you can be prepared to develop doctrine, be able to operate with the people you're about to go to war with, but you need to be in theatre, to immerse yourself in theatre and to understand what changes that you need to make, and some of them are material changes, and you've got to have the organisation who's prepared to accept that as well. I think we have time for one more question. We do. What role will UAVs play in ship-to-shore humanitarian aid and disaster relief amphibious logistics? And that's for the panel. So, Rhys, you're the logistics guy.
Oh, gee. Thanks. Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, the role of UAVs in logistics, ship to shore.
That's a long way ahead from where my mind's at. I don't know. Can you guys give me a hand here, and I'll come back to it.
I think UAVs, but remote autonomous vehicles and all this are going to be absolutely key. So how do you get everything from under the sea? So I'm at UWA, we have an Oceans Institute, and one of the things we have is an autonomous glider that floats around the Indian Ocean collecting information. We do that from an Indian Ocean's research point of view, but funnily enough it has a defence application, and we spend a lot of time talking to Defence about that as well. So how are you going to, I think particularly in contested areas, get in to do that sort of beach reconnaissance, understanding the reefs and the shoals, the close inshore area? How do you use in the future autonomous vehicles or UAVs to actually deliver logistics from ship to shore as well? I think they're all going to be really key elements of how we operate into the future. The big question we all have, I think, for that is how quickly can we adapt to that type of stuff? Not just the technology. As a military historian who looks at that intersection between doctrine and technology, often the technology exists, but it's the doctrine that actually makes it work, and the intersection of that into a system with the people. So you can have a really, the French had really capable tanks, far more capable tanks than the Germans did, say, in 1940, but they didn't have doctrine, a training system, an organisation system, and an operating concept to make it work. So they got beaten by an enemy who had inferior technical capabilities and platforms, but superior doctrine, capability, training, formation, organisation. So I think the intersection of how quickly can we adapt that technology into that approach is going to be really key. But yeah, it's going to be a very big autonomous future, I feel.
Okay, thanks very much, Pete. To the audience, thank you very much for your attention and for your good questions. And to the panel, thank you very much for your presentations.